In this video, I'm going to talk about data modeling, and in particular how it applies to text file processing. So data modeling and LINQ queries work together. So in the last video, we went through some examples of how you can use the LINQ query syntax against an array of data or against a list of class data. And the LINQ query syntax allows us to very kind of easily extract very good data sets from an existing data set. What data modeling can help us do is we can transfer data from a text file into a container that contains that data inside objects. So for example, here I have a data file that has a first name column, a last name column, and ID number column. What I could do is, instead of just reading each line of the text file and trying to parse and process the data in line, what I can instead do is create a class that wraps around each line of data. So here I have a class that started that has a first name property, last name property, and ID. And then my process is going to be reading a line of data from the file, creating an object of our modeled class, and then storing that object into a container like a list or an array. So when we create a class to model the file data, we need to make sure we have properties, we expose properties that store key attributes. We perhaps want to provide methods that implement key behaviors. So if there's something that we can calculate based off of the data coming in, we can embed that into our class. And we can create constructors and helper methods that help us work with building these objects. So some things to consider might be, do I want to strip a line of text from the file in my application and parse it into its pieces and then put those pieces into a very sparse data model? Or perhaps do I want to do something like create a constructor or a helper method that just takes a raw line of data from the file, and then the constructor itself will do the parsing and break it down into its pieces and store it where it needs to go. So these are trade-offs to think about. And another thing to think about when you're modeling the class is, where do you want to put error checking? Do you want to put the error checking primarily in the application? Do you want to embed the error checking into a class? For example, are you testing for dirty data? Lots of things to think about. So the way you model your data, it's up to you. Something to think about is that not all data from a file has to be included in a data model. So only the values that you need to do the work should be modeled. So for example, if I have a data file that has 30 columns of data, but I only am focused on maybe 3 columns worth of data, I don't need to create a class that contains a property for every single column. I could create a sparse class that maybe only has 3 or 4 key properties, and the rest of the data I don't worry about. So here I've listed kind of some generic steps on how you might approach processing a text file using data modeling and LINQ methods. So maybe the first step you would want to do is take the data file you want to process and check it out, analyze it. Determine which pieces of the data that you want to put into your class model, and then create a class that models that file data. Then you want to potentially create a container like a list or an array that will hold types of objects of this model type. Then we're going to create an application that allows the user to make a connection to a file, and we're going to start processing, reading each line of the file, and every time we read a line from the file, instead of processing right there then and there, I'm going to take the data of the file, split it up, and create an object based on that line of data. And then I'm going to add that object to the list. And then finally, once all of the data from the file has been stripped from the file and inserted into a list structure or an array structure, then I can start creating LINQ queries to extract information from those results. There are some trade-offs to think about when you are considering just doing straight logic processing versus data modeling and LINQ queries. Consider a very large data file that has, maybe millions of rows. And maybe in those millions of rows, there's dozens of columns. It's a huge data set. If I were to try to create a data model and store each line of the file into an object, and potentially a very large object, and then create an array or a list that contains, millions of these objects, that's going to require a large amount of memory in your application. When instead, if you just read the data from the file line by line, you can process the values in line, throw the line away, and then you get the next line. So just sometimes doing straight logic processing as you read each line is a very fast, efficient way to handle file processing. On the other hand, when you do inline processing like that, where you read line by line and just process it, if you have to process, or if you have to run multiple queries against the data set, that means you have to reread the file again and again and again each time you want to extract a result. So the trade-off there is, if instead I store all the data from the file into a list of objects, that does take memory, but I only have to read the data from the file one time. So it's a single read operation. I extract the valuable information, store it in a list. Then if the user is going to create multiple queries against my application, all they have to do is query against this extracted data set. I don't have to read to a file anymore. So, maybe if your application is going to be doing many queries against a data set, maybe the data modeling LINQ Query approach will be more efficient. Whereas if you are processing a large data set and once the data set is read, you basically process it and you're done, then maybe straight line logic is the best way to go. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to create 2 videos that go through examples using data modeling and LINQ queries to extract information. And so hopefully through those example videos you will feel more comfortable with this approach.